Okay. You can make a little introduction. Do we have a topic? Oh, good. Do you want to make a little introduction? No, yeah, just brief a little bit here.
So thank you all for joining us this evening. We have a very special guest with us today, known as His Holiness H.D.Goswami, and also known as Howard Resnick, PhD from Harvard. Thank you for welcoming him tonight. And so he's been practicing and teaching Bhakti Yoga or Krishna consciousness for almost 50-something years. I don't know.
54.
54 to be exact. Traveling all over the world, spending a lot of time in South America, establishing Krishna consciousness there, and North America and Europe and all over the world for decades now. And his specialty is really understanding the scriptures very thoroughly, being able to explain them in a very logical, rational way. So today we decided to do a question and answers session because I can hardly think of anyone who can answer questions better than H.D.Goswami.
No pressure.
Not at all. So I don't know if you want to start with anything, but if you came prepared with questions, I know Malik just read your version of the Bhagavad Gita, so he might have some questions prepared. So
yes,
we can start with some and then see how the conversation goes. That was not a sufficient introduction.
No, it was actually quite long enough. Yeah.
Okay. We'll probably have some people trickling in too.
Okay, tricklers. So happy to be here with you tonight. And any questions? Please, yeah. Would you like to
I have one question, sir.
Sure.
In your book, you said the Comprehensive Guide to Bhagavad Gita. You said that that the soul is doesn't contact material reality, and that it is like an observer and not an actor within the body. And I wondered, how is it that why don't souls immediately go to Krishna if they remember if they don't interact with material body,
right.
They don't take action? How is it that they receive that karma and have to get trapped in?
Okay, good question. The problem is they don't know they're not material. In other words, like in a dream, you may take on another persona in a dream, and it's not till you wake up that you understand your real identity. So it's like a child, for example. Let's say a baby is in the parent's home, but the baby has no idea that there are parents, that this is a home, or it's just so. In the same way, we are we forget who we really are and where we really are. And so the body is like a virtual reality machine. And I remember one time years ago, I'm from Los Angeles. So one time, for some inexplicable reason, I was at Universal Studios, and they have this ride where it's like a rocket ride. And so, there are a bunch of people there, all, normal, respectable people. And so at one point, it looked like we were going to crash into this planet. And all these people who are just sort of normal, educated people, they were all ducking and, covering themselves because it was so real. And so actually there was no danger. It was just Universal Studios. But so we think that we are the body. It's like a dream. We imagine we are the body, and we take on an identity, which is often called in English a false ego. The word ego, of course, is just the Greek word I. So ego ultimately just means a sense of I, your sense of personal identity. So the problem is, if we knew where we were, And if we knew what was really going on, there would be no problem. The problem is that we don't know, or that people in general forget. And so in the process of Krishna consciousness, well, you could say, for example, why do we forget? What makes us forget? Attachment and repulsion. So let's say, for example, you travel to another country and you have, for some duty, it could be business, it could be diplomacy, it could be, whatever. And let's say you don't really feel any connection with that country. You just happen to be there, which is my experience, traveling to many countries. And so the local news is just not so relevant. You may look at, see if there's any international news or news about your country, but the local news, local politics, someone's running for mayor of whatever town, is just not relevant to you. So we're actually just visiting this world. We are not, no one has a permanent visa for the material universe. Everyone is just visiting here. But because we take these bodies, and the body is attracted to certain material objects. It can be the bodies of other people. It can be a house, a car. It can be fame. It can be all kinds of things. But because we become attached to things in this world, and certain things displease us, certain things may even disgust us. And so Krishna says we get trapped in these dualities where, I want this and I hate that. And so as we know, just as attachment to another person is a very strong emotion, and hatred is equally strong. In fact, attachment often turns into hatred because it's just the flip side. It's a very intense emotional reaction to another person, which may be positive or negative. Let's say if there's someone that you're not that attached to, it's just like, oh yeah, that's my neighbor Jack or something. Someone who you're not really interested in, then you won't really feel repulsion either. You won't love or hate the person. It's just some person there. So, so because it's through the body that we are experiencing the physical world, and we become attached and we become averse to certain things. And because of this attachment and aversion, we come to identify with the body and take it as ourselves. And we know right now in this country and other countries, there's so much madness and hatred between different sectors of the population over bodies. And so rather than drag everyone down to the bodily concept, which some people do in the name of liberation or whatever they think they're doing, the actual solution is to lift everyone up, because that's the common denominator. No, speak English. Actually, I'm a robot, and there's a problem. Because actually, all of us are souls. So externally, someone has a male body, female body, young body, old body, middle-aged body, this race, that ethnicity, this age, or whatever. But that's just superficial. Inside the bodies, we're all the same brand. It's an appropriate analogy for a capitalist society. We are all simply souls. So as far as gender issues, for example, if someone can see that we're all just souls, it's irrelevant what kind of body you have, or what gender your body is, in terms of the respect that's due a person. And so, unfortunately, there are groups of people who think they will solve this problem by balkanizing the country, by dividing people up, and the only thing that links them, these two groups, is mutual hatred. And they think somehow that's going to make a better society. So in the name of progress, they're simply destroying society. So the real solution is Krishna consciousness, because you don't achieve equality and justice by dragging everyone down to an animal consciousness where you identify with your body. We can improve society by lifting everyone up to a higher common denominator, which is that we're all souls. And therefore, since we're all souls, to abuse anyone, to exploit anyone, to think you're better than anyone is just ignorance. So those are the two approaches: dragging everyone down to an animal level or lifting everyone up to a spiritual level. So, any other question? Yes. Hey, by the way, do I win prizes if I answer the questions?
It's a point system, Mars.
Okay.
100 points awarded.
So I've been thinking, sorry, my voice is, I'm trying my best.
No te preocupes.
Yes. So the question will be like, it's a two-part question. One is, what's the reason why the soul wanted to forget Krishna? And I heard that's very personal. And the second part is it relevant to know? I mean, we are in this situation now. Does it matter to know? It's like, I imagine like hurting someone I really love and just trying to forget that person. And then I'm in this situation where,
Well, okay. First of all, we discussed that extensively the other day, but we can revisit that. If someone wants to be the center, no situation in which you're not the center will be attractive. For example, when I was an undergraduate student at Berkeley, recently, in the context of millennia. So I remember when I was an undergraduate student at Berkeley, I saw this advertisement that for applications to this sort of men's, it wasn't a fraternity, but kind of like that. It was a men's residential association. Some very rich person had endowed it, purchased this, beautiful residential property. And so if you were admitted into this group, then it was rent free, and it's almost like modeled after one of those famous sort of residential societies, Oxford and Cambridge. You live with a certain group and you have dinner together and all that stuff. And so I thought, well, what really struck me was the free part, because I was a poor student at that time. And so I applied in a very irrational, frontal cortex deficient way. So I was just a young guy, and I just, I gave them a stack of all my poetry. I and about 10 million other people falsely thought that, we were all great poets. But actually, in retrospect, of course, I wasn't selected. But I didn't really want to be chosen. I didn't really make an effort. I didn't really find out, like, okay, what do they want to hear? And the reason was, even though it was, I'd stay in a much nicer house than I was in, and in a better part of Berkeley. If you know Berkeley, the north side is better than the south side. North side was kind of like graduate students. South side was sort of undergraduate. And near Oakland, which was a liability then. So, but the idea of not having the freedom, the idea of being in a regimented environment where, okay, you have to, you have to come and dress for dinner and sit there and just, all the sort of the restrictions on my grossly misused freedom at the time. But so all of that was, I just didn't want it, because I was so attached to my freedom, so attached to just doing whatever I wanted to do at that point in my life. And so it's something like that. It's not hatred of God. It's not necessarily that it's just that, it's like an experiment. What would it be like if I had more freedom? And also, we're down in the material world, and as Prabhupada explained, we can reincarnate thousands and millions of times. But when you go back to the spiritual world, it's just like a bad dream. It's like you wake up from a dream, because we are eternal. Krishna makes it very clear in the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, that's really good news. If anyone's in the market for immortality, that's really good news. And actually, Krishna says we're eternal in the full sense of the term, because the sort of the Middle Eastern concept of eternity became Middle Eastern religions, that you never existed, now you're created, ex nihilo, from nothing, which is actually, according to one good scholar of the Old Testament, a lady that teaches at Yale, I forgot her name, but I was watching a lecture, and she explained that actually the Old Testament doesn't really say that we're created ex nihilo. That was sort of a misinterpretation by early Christians. And so, but the idea that you're created from nothing, this is your first life, which is actually a catastrophic move, philosophically speaking. Because if we are existing for the first time, never existed before, there's an insurmountable, horrendous philosophical problem, which is called theodicy. Namely, how do you justify that the world is created by and governed by an all-merciful, all-knowing, all-powerful God, and yet this world is just ridiculous? I mean, the sheer quantity of injustice, of apparently innocent people suffering. And so this has actually been the main ammunition for a very long time for atheistic philosophers. And the solution to this problem doesn't really exist. I mean, there was one great, really like very distinguished philosopher who was also Christian, faithful Christian, named Alvin Plantinga, who taught for many years at Notre Dame. And he mounted this philosophical defense saying that, but in a sense, I think what he was going for was not a home run. It was more like, beat out a bunt or something, because he was saying that, sorry, baseball. He said that if God permits evil to prevent a greater evil, then that is not a moral defect in God. And so he said that if God did not allow people, let's say with bad intentions, to carry out their bad intentions, then they would not have free will. And so to prevent that greater evil of stripping souls of their free will, God permits that evil of injustice. Now, the problem there, I mean, it's good as far as it goes. The problem there is obvious. And that is, God is still allowing injustice. And let's just take a little detour here to one of the great Christian philosophers, and Anselmo, who lived in England. And he gave what is called the ontological proof. Somehow we're into philosophy. See, watch out when you go to a Hare Krishna program. So Anselm gave what is called an ontological proof for the existence of God. In other words, it's proof based on just the nature of God's existence. And it's interesting because it's a sort of deductive proof. A water, yes, please, and a menu. So there are other kinds of proofs of God's existence which are more inductive. In other words, you look around and see what the world is, and you conclude there must be a God. Like, for example, if you see all the beauty of the world, or you see that despite all of its madness, the world is rational in this sense, that at least physically, the universe obeys laws. It's a law-abiding universe. And these laws are basically the laws of physics, and you could say chemistry, just the material laws, and that we live in a law-abiding universe. which, by the way, sort of triggered the scientific revolution because they thought if we live in a law-abiding universe, there must be a lawgiver. So can be called natural theology, that you come to the conclusion of God based on the nature of this world. And there are other powerful arguments in that regard. For example, Darwin, poor Darwin, he was actually on the church council of his local church, because otherwise his wife probably would have beat him upside the head. But anyway, his wife was like religious. So Darwin was operating with what we now understand to be a very primitive understanding of biology. Because if you look at the world, say 170 years ago, 160 years ago, biologists just didn't know that much. And so Darwin's notion of evolution is very primitive. So to give one example, let's give one example that we now know from microbiology that that every cell in your body is almost like a fully digitized Amazon warehouse. I mean, you can find these things on YouTube, but every cell in your body has just almost, unbelievable technical sophistication. So that's one point, that our bodies are actually millions of times more, in terms of the engineering, more advanced, more sophisticated than Darwin ever dreamed. Now, there's another problem, that so what we can do is we can actually, through mathematics, we can derive the probability of a certain state of events taking place physically. For example, the simplest example, which is always given, you throw up a coin, is it can come down heads or tails, so it's like 50-50 if you throw it enough times. So, and then if you say, what's the probability of it coming up, let's say heads 3 times in a row, and you can calculate that. Or, for example, let's say you take a handful of coins and throw them onto the grass. What's the probability that all the coins will land exactly in certain spaces? And then the probability starts to get really, really nasty. In other words, like it's just not going to happen. Or you can say things like, if you put a monkey on a piano, what are the odds that he would just spontaneously, let's say, compose a piano sonata by Schubert? Not even compose, he would just happen to play it. And then it becomes like ridiculously, absurdly improbable. Well, the probability that your body evolved by itself without any input of intelligence is like billions of times less probable than the monkey playing the piano sonata. Billions of times more improbable. In other words, we now know enough about microbiology to know that the idea of unaided evolution is absurdly improbable. It's actually an absurdity, which is why so many scientists are now rethinking their metaphysics. And so there's another problem that Darwin didn't understand. And that is, let's say, because according to the standard evolution theory, which has become a religion, by the way, it's a fanatical religion. Just like, for example, if you look at European churches, European universities, let's say about 400 years ago, even after Galileo, who, by the way, was religious, he just didn't like the Pope, and mostly because of Galileo's own personality disorders, but that's another issue. So if you look after Galileo, after Newton was like the bomb. Newton changed everything. Before Newton, everyone in Europe really believed that they lived in Middle Earth. There were trolls under bridges, and they really lived in Middle Earth in Europe. So even after Galileo, after Newton, after Kepler, after Copernicus, after all these people, the European universities were still teaching astronomy and things that, you know, from like thousands of years ago, or at least 1,500 years ago. Why? By this sort of fanatical conservatism. So in the same way, universities are still teaching this absurd idea that evolution happens by itself, even though mathematically it's now become absurd. It's become ridiculous. It obviously didn't happen. And to give another example, why? That according to Darwin and according to evolution theory to this day, a particular mutation is naturally selected because it bestows a reproductive advantage on the mutated thing. I mean, for examples of mutation, you just have to watch Marvel movies. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so because obviously, let's say there's a mutation where, let's say some animal was born without the ability to smell. That would be a disadvantage. That wouldn't survive because it would be easy prey. But now one positive mutation, which bestows an extraordinary reproductive advantage, is the development of eyes, so you can see. I mean, clearly, a creature that sees has just almost, unlimited advantage over a creature that can't see. So now, what do we need to be the case in order to get eyes? How do you get a mutation where a creature that didn't have eyes now has eyes? Well, if we look at microbiology, what we're going to find is that it takes actually thousands and thousands, if not millions, of micromutations. Because Darwin just thought, okay, no eye, boom, mutation. No, that's not the way the body actually works. You need a huge number of micromutations. The problem is that none of these, let's say, thousands of micromutations bestow any reproductive advantage whatsoever until the whole system's complete. So it's simply impossible to explain why those thousands of mutations would be selected. They wouldn't be selected. Secondly, the probability of not only getting all these mutations, but getting them in the right order, because if in the wrong order, if you're assembling like a computer, you have to assemble things in the right order. You can't build the roof of a house before you lay the foundation. And so the odds of all these mutations happening are ridiculous. I mean, it's almost infinitely no. And then the odds of getting them in the right order, it just becomes just a cartoon. I mean, it's ridiculous. And then the odds of all of them being selected, even though they bestow absolutely no reproductive advantage, it just becomes a total ludicrous thing. It's not science. It's stupid religion. And more people are realizing that, and can I get into one more point on this? It's like those things, you buy something, don't take this back to the store, call this number. So don't ask for a refund for this lecture. Wait, anyway, so so why would people in science departments at respectable universities teach nonsense, even though the world's gone far beyond that? For the same reason that even after Newton, they were teaching Ptolemy's astronomy from, like 1,500 years before that, which everyone knew mathematically is false. Just like we know mathematically it's false that things evolve by themselves without God. We know math, and they knew that mathematically, Ptolemy's, he was a nice Greek scientist that lived about roughly 1,500 years before Newton, because the church was attached to it. There was a very important book written, actually, I think in the 1960s or so, which is extremely influential in academia. It's a classic. It was written by a man, I think Thomas Kuhn is his name, Kuhn, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And what he showed, he was a historian of science, what he showed to everyone's satisfaction, I mean, it's not really debated, is that the old picture that scientists are just these sort of benign, selfless, knowledge-loving angels who, they have one theory and they look at the evidence and they're gradually, inexorably refining their theories, and all that matters is, where's the knowledge and what experiment is valid, and they're just sort of these selfless searchers for higher knowledge. What Kuhn showed is that's complete nonsense. Actually, what's really happening is that they're very attached to their name and fame. They're very attached to their positions, and that it's actually generational. In other words, you have one generation of scientists. They have all the really nice positions at the best universities, and they spend their whole lives teaching something. And then, whoops, it turns out there's a contradiction. There's an anomaly, and the anomalies start to pile up. And at first, they try to explain them away by kind of refining their theories. But at a certain point, the anomalies and the problems in the theory become so great that it's unsustainable. So what do? Nothing. They keep teaching the same thing. But eventually, their final contribution to science is they die. And before dying, they retire. And then a new generation of scientists comes in who have not staked their reputation and their careers and everything else on this old theory. And they say, well, this doesn't make sense. And so that's how science actually goes forward. And as far as the theories, there's this thing they do where, for example, if you say, there's a God, his name is Krishna, they'll say, prove it, which is itself an idiotic thing to say for the following reason. There's a certain process. Whoops. Okay. What?
It's in your lap.
It's in my lap. Why am I? Go back to my psychiatrist, find out why I'm self-destructive. Oh, okay. What do I? Oops. I think it's in there. So there's a process which is crucial to the empirical method, which is experiment design. Like, for example, let's say you can't find your car keys. You're not going to go look up in the sky for your car keys because the car keys under normal circumstances don't float up into the sky. If you lost a balloon, you might look in the sky. And so when you search for something, let's say you're trying to measure how far it is from here to the other side of the street, you wouldn't use a thermometer because that's what you use to look for temperatures. So in experiment design, I'll give you one example. When I was at UCLA as an undergraduate, I had to take an astronomy course. I had a science requirement that I'd avoided my whole life. And so I finally took an astronomy course. And at UCLA, there were some scholars in the astronomy department who were heading up this important project to prove that there are such things as brown dwarfs. And the brown dwarf is not a human type. A brown dwarf means a celestial body that's in the process of becoming a star, which means you have to get this internal combustion, and then it gets hotter and hotter. At a certain point, it just sort of, the curtains open, it goes on the stage in Broadway and becomes a star. But I mean, astronomically speaking, that means that it becomes so hot it actually becomes a star. But just like whether it's Broadway or some baseball team, whatever, some people don't make the cut. And so celestial bodies that don't make the cut and never become stars, they're kind of doomed to be brown dwarfs. Do you need to do that now? ¿Necesitas hacer eso ahora? Tú.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just drinking water.
Fine, you drink water, pero sin ruido, por favor.
Perdón.
So, they'd never, my Krishna, they'd never actually proved that there are brown dwarfs. But what they did is they said, well, if they exist, this is how we would detect them. And the method for detecting, the methodology, the specific empiric methodology for detecting a brown dwarf was based on what they thought they knew about it. Because if you don't know anything about it, you can't search for it. If I say, I will give $1 million to anyone that brings me a Fickelstrom, and it's like, I really have $1 million and I really give it to you. And you say, well, what is a Fickelstrom? And I said, well, I'm not going to tell you. That would make it too easy. Like, tell me, no, I won't tell you anything about it. Is it an idea? Is it a physical object? Is it a force in the universe? What is it? No. If you don't know anything about it, logically, a priori, you cannot search for it. It is logically impossible to search for something that either you know nothing about or you have no belief about the nature of it. Having some idea of what something is a logical precursor to anything like a search. And therefore, if we're trying to design a search for God, let's say you don't know if God exists, but it's your best shot at immortality, and dying is not attractive to you. And so you're trying to find out if there's a God. Well, you would, if you were actually a rational human being, you would immediately understand that the empirical method is totally irrelevant. Why? Because the essence of the empirical method is the controlled experiment. And therefore, by definition, the empirical method can only search for things that you can control. But in this case, you're searching for something that you can't control because it is infinitely greater than you. And therefore, to use a method which absolutely depends on your control to search for something that is absolutely beyond your control is stupid. It's foolish. It's not scientific. It's just madness. So therefore, if you're trying to design an experiment to look for God, what you would ask, the first question you would ask, if you were being rational, is, what kind of God am I looking for? With what features? With what characteristics? And let's say you're looking for sort of the standard triple O God, which is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, or all good, all strong, all powerful. No, all good, all strong, all knowledgeable. Yes, all knowing, which is the German word. English is a combination of Latin and Germanic words. So you can say omniscient, which is pure Latin, or all knowing, which is German. So that's what you would design. So therefore, logically, based on your experience as a human being on this planet, how do you gain access to things greater than you? Now, the first obvious superiority is that God is more powerful than you. Let's say the God you're searching for, whether he exists or not, he or she or they or whatever, I'm looking for someone who is infinitely more powerful than me. And therefore, the controlled experiment is an absurd option. It's a non-option. And so in this world, maybe I can, by analogy, in this world, if someone's in a stronger position than me, how do I gain access to that person? How do I gain knowledge? For example, let's say you're applying for a job. And let's say that there are many people who have similar qualifications to yours. So they don't need you. In fact, let's say they have 1,000 applications for 3 positions, and you're not extraordinarily qualified. So you go out, you buy one of those little books, Job Interviews for Dummies. And basically what you're going to learn is that I have to somehow ingratiate myself. Let's say you're applying to some very selective university. what do they want to hear? How do I please them so that they want me? Because I need them, they don't need me. So it turns out that service and, in a sense, devotion is the way you gain access to and knowledge of greater things. So it turns out that bhakti yoga, where you try to know God by serving God, is the scientific method to know God. It actually is the scientific method. But since scientists generally do not take a single philosophy course in college, they're not actually aware of all this. But going back to the problem of evil, because I want to get back that, just tie that up. The problem of evil. But then you could say, well, how could there be a God? At least if there is a God, it's not an all good God. It's not an omnibenevolent God, because the world's a mess and there is no justice. It's not a God that cares about justice. It's not a God that, that cares. And so therefore, even if there is a supreme intelligence or supreme power, it's not anything that really deserves religious worship. So, and so that's the main argument that's given against the existence of God. And even if there's some higher intelligence, it's not the God you're worshiping. So now this problem became just completely intractable, completely impossible to resolve by religions who say that this is our first life, for obvious reasons. So if saying that we are created from nothing, we never existed before, and this is our first life, if it makes it sort of logically impossible for there to be an all good, all powerful, all knowing God, why would they say that? Well, that gets back into history and the nature of the Middle East. So, but the point is that, so Plantinga, this philosopher, he wanted to defend Christian doctrine. And he made that argument, which I've already explained, that we can justify God permitting an evil only if, by doing so, God is preventing a greater evil, namely taking away free will. Now, but you see, so Anselm, actually tying everything back, I'm walking all the way back now, so you won't think that, I'm not perfectly coherent at this point in my life. But so Anselm gave the argument, this about 1,000 years ago. He's one of the great Christian philosophers. And Anselm gave the argument. Oh, I know. Okay, I know how I got into this whole thing. Okay, I found my way back, because I made little marks on the trees as I went into the forest. That natural theology means you look around at the world and you say, no way such a world could come about without a God. And just to wrap up that's sort of like an inductive or an analytic argument for God. And to wrap that up, one of the strongest arguments for God's existence, based on, you could say, a form of natural theology, is called it was actually first given, at least that we know of, by Aristotle. And it's also called the argument from contingency, or the cosmological argument. And that is that everything that we see in the world, every physical object, this house, your body, whatever, depends on something else for its existence. For example, let's say you plant the seed of a flower, and then that seed is somehow gathering to itself, nutrients from the soil, sunlight, it has to be, watered. And then it becomes, so that, let's say that bush, flowering bush, depended for its existence on many other things. And all those things, for example, let's say the soil has nutrients because all kinds of other things are going in there, and so on. And so everything that exists depends on something else for its existence. And therefore, everything that we can observe in the physical world is contingent, which is simply another way of saying it depends on something else for its existence. So Aristotle, who was bright, Aristotle brought up the point that if everything in the world depends on something else for its existence, how could anything ever exist? Why isn't it the case that nothing exists? And he concluded through logic, not so much through piety. He wasn't like super religious Aristotle, but he was reasonable and wasn't demonic. And so Aristotle concluded that there must be, in his terms, an unmoved mover. There must be an original cause which is uncaused. Because otherwise, by logic, not by piety, by logic, how could anything exist? Still a good argument, by the way. 2,300 years, it's aged very well. So that's kind of like those kinds of arguments. And then Anselm gave an argument where it wasn't based on observing the natural world. It was based just on pure logic. And it's called the ontological argument for God. And he said that, whenever you hear it, it sounds like a logical trick, although it's still bedeviling atheistic philosophers of this day. They're just like, it's like a nemesis. Anselm said, God is that being, than whom no greater being can exist. And therefore, if God doesn't exist, I could imagine a greater being, namely a God that does exist. You can see it's just like some tricky thing, but so rather than argue for or against, like, is this really a valid argument? What I want to do is take, in a sense, the pious essence of his argument, not just examine the technical logic, and say that if we accept that God is a being than whom no greater being can exist, then that God could not be a God who only gives us one life. If you have children and you love your children, and the children are very lovable and extremely annoying, and nothing personal. I was a very annoying child. I think much more annoying than you. So the point is, when you love someone, you don't give up on them. If you think you love someone, but it's really sort of selfishly motivated, like you want something out of it, if you're not getting what you wanted, then you can dump that person. But if you truly love someone, you don't stop loving them if you truly love them. And as we know, it's not that easy to become a saint. In fact, before I wrote my novel, infomercial alert, and I won't talk about it. Before I wrote my novel, I studied novel writing because I don't want to do it seriously. I'm doing it for Krishna. I don't want to just produce some junk in the name of Krishna. And one of the things they tell, like, professional advice for writers, is that, let's say you're doing the 12-step hero's journey, which one famous movie producer studied very carefully. It's from Joseph Campbell. He studied it and made a whole movie just based on the 12-step hero's journey. And the producer and the director and the writer is George Lucas, and the movie is Star Wars, which was based very faithfully on this 12-step hero's journey, which is a sort of typical plot, typical story, which Campbell found throughout the world in ancient literature. But in any case, one of the advice they give you is that you want to keep your heroes a hero. You don't want the reader to give up on them or the audience. But people don't change that much. In other words, you can't take your hero and, let's say, he's kind of a bum, and then he sees the light, he meets the guru, and then suddenly becomes. In other words, people don't change that much. Even Arjuna. Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, he heard from Krishna, and then he changed, but he just gave up his depression, but he was still Arjuna. He just, had a little emotional problem, and then he got over it. So in that way, here we are in the material world. Let's say, we're fallen, and we're, we have all kinds of attachments and, things that prevent us from, hurling ourselves into the most advanced levels of Krishna consciousness. And so why wouldn't you give someone all the time they need. Like if you're God and you have infinite love for souls, why would you make it like this ridiculous, neurotic version of beat the clock? I mean, why not just give people the time they need? And if someone is sort of having, a bestial moment in their existence, give them a beast body, try it out, take it for a test drive, and then come back when you're, a little more serious. So so therefore, what I would say to Anselm is, we can imagine a God greater than one who tortures people forever, greater than a God who gives you, one short little life, and if you don't make it, sorry, you stupid loser. And that's Krishna. And we'd also want a God. I mean, if God is not really like drop dead good looking, then that's another problem. Because why wouldn't God be the most beautiful existence ever? I mean, a God who's not good looking, a God who's doesn't have a sense of humor. I mean, with all due respect, I mean, Yahweh is not famous for a sense of humor. And I mean, it's the same God. I'm not saying that, the people being worshipped in different traditions, it's not God. They're not worshiping a false God. What I'm saying is they have sort of an incomplete description of God, not that it's a false God. So when you see Krishna, Rupa Goswami gave an argument similar to Anselm in saying that Krishna is the supreme form of God because he has more qualities than Shiva or Vishnu and so on. So it's really a kind of Anselmian argument saying that because if God is infinitely great, then the greatest concept of God is the most true. Simple logic. God is infinitely great. The greatest idea of God is the most true. And so what people have found for many thousands of years, including Greek ambassadors to India thousands of years ago, what people have found is that if you, try to practice bhakti yoga based on Krishna, you get reciprocation and, you win the lottery. And Krishna is really there. And people have been discovering that for many thousands of years, forever, really, because it's true. Because it's actually true. And so, so if we want knowledge, we want happiness, if we want perfect love, bhakti yoga, it really is the way. Not because I'm a true believer or because I'm sectarian or fanatical. I mean, even though I am, that's not the point. I mean, Krishna consciousness is true because if you examine it carefully, you'll find logically, philosophically, experientially, in every way, it's actually superior. It doesn't mean other traditions are false. We're not talking about false, the true religion and the false religion, the living God and the dead God. It's like highly toxic language introduced by Paul. It's we're simply saying that it's the advanced course. And again, if you want scientific proof of God, you have to know how to scientifically design an experiment. And if you do so, all roads lead to Krishna. Just one last thing I'll say on this, then I'll open the floor for praise and donations. And that is India. Oh, I'm kidding. India, for 2 semesters, I taught the history of India at the University of Florida. And one thing that struck me is that India is the best place in the world to study the variety of religions for obvious reasons. Well, reasons which I hope will seem obvious to you when I tell you. One thing is, if you look at a map of India, a river map, you can type that into your browser, you'll find that India has by far, the greatest system of natural irrigation on Earth. You'll also find, if you study India, it has every conceivable climate and soil condition. It goes. I mean, it has the highest mountains in the world. You can go from the coldest Arctic weather to steamy tropical jungles and everything in between, deserts, rainforests, semi-arid plains. That is everything. The significance of that is that until very recently, wealth came from agriculture, and so India. Plus, it had all the jewels and everything. So India, up until a few centuries ago, had something like 30 or 40% of all the wealth in the world, just natural wealth. And so you have a country which is big enough and rich enough, and irrigated soil, climate, everything, to sustain a large population. So what we find is, this is just simple demographics. What we find is, from ancient times, India did in fact sustain, comparatively compared to other countries in the world, a large population. Second fact, what we find is that people in India have always been strongly inclined toward spirituality and religion. The third fact, which is essential, is that India has always been a place of religious freedom. I mean, there were some little hiccups there when India was governed by fanatical religious leaders, such as the Muslim invasion. And there were so many atrocities that, believe me, I'm not exaggerating. And so, so you have a country which is rich and supports a large population, which is inclined toward religion and spirituality, and which has religious freedom, and has always had religious freedom in its own culture. I mean, to give one shocking example, Buddhism, of course, arose in India. Buddha is a Sanskrit word. And I mean, imagine in Europe back, if you would have, imagine Europe in the Middle Ages, if you would have said, the Bible's false, it's all nonsense. I mean, your life expectancy could probably be measured in seconds, and if you were very lucky, in minutes. Even in the Greco-Roman world, you had freedom of religion, but if you were offending their gods and goddesses, they would take care of you. You could worship what you wanted, but you couldn't offend the civic deities. And so, but in India, Buddhism arose, and they were openly preaching that the Vedas are all, forget the Vedas, the Vedas are not where it's at. That's false. You couldn't do that anywhere else in the world. And what happened to those people? Nothing. They just triggered debates. They were opposed, but with philosophical debates and not with violence. India is the only place in the world where Jews were never persecuted. And so, so you have a lot of people spiritually inclined and with freedom. And so therefore, India has manifested historically by far the greatest variety of religious systems, specifically for that reason. And so because it was a free society, you can actually see who won. In other words, who was able to capture the hearts and minds of the people. And so again, I had to study all this stuff because I was teaching it. And the simple answer is, in this open marketplace of ideas, of theologies, of spiritual paths, by far the big winner was Krishna. Not by persecution, not by coercion, but simply because more people wanted it. An open and fair marketplace of ideas, historically, the big winner was Krishna. So, and that was in a, let's say, spiritually very sophisticated society. If you look at the debates they had between Buddhists and Vaishnavas and impersonalists and karmic monks, I mean, extremely sophisticated intellectual debates, where just to compete, just to get into the league, if you wanted to compete, you had to master formal logic. You had to be an absolute master of Sanskrit grammar. You had to know philosophy. You had to know all the texts. It was a high stakes intellectual game. And then there was the, and then the people in general who weren't into all of that. They just, what appeals me, what makes sense to me. In fact, one of the reasons that Buddhism, sort of began to vanish in India is that huge numbers of Buddhists became Vaishnavas. And of course, the ones that were left, the Muslims killed. To each his own. So, therefore, what I'm saying is that if Krishna consciousness is given a chance, and if we present it in a reasonable, non-eccentric way, in terms of our appearance, in terms of, taking the time and trouble to just present it appropriately, then history will repeat itself. And we will get a growing, powerful spiritual movement which respects the sanctity of all life, not just humans, not just speciesism, as it's called, that respects all life, that actually understands the equality of all people, and that has a concept of God so informative, so detailed, that it can actually inspire people to turn to God, because it's not vague, it's not abstract, it's not menacing. It's just that God is infinitely beautiful. One time a devotee wrote a letter to Prabhupada saying, "We're trying to spread Krishna consciousness, please give us a secret weapon." And Prabhupada wrote back, "Your secret weapon is Krishna's beauty." In fact, whatever beauty you see in this world, if you consider yourself beautiful, which you may be, or if you consider another person beautiful, if you consider nature, some parts at least, beautiful, I mean, if you admire and cultivate beauty in your life, then there is something that is infinitely beautiful. Because after all, there's an argument also given, I think it was Aristotle, but that, for example, what does it mean to say that Dallas is north of Houston? Well, one thing it means is that it's less humid. But another thing you could ask is, what does it mean? What do we mean when we say that point A is north of point B? We mean it's closer to the North Pole. And of course, vice versa for the South. So the point here is, unless you have an absolute reference point, comparative descriptions are meaningless. For example, so what does it mean to say that this is more beautiful than that? What does that even mean? What's the reference point? And so ultimately there's an absolute reference point. There's absolute beauty. And so in that sense, beauty is not merely in the eye of the beholder. So generally, we consider, in this materialistic age, we say something is relative. We say that, let's say objective and subjective. We say that quantities are objective, but qualities are subjective. In other words, that if I say, let's say it's so many inches between me and the computer, that's objective. That's actually how many inches it is. But if I say that so-and-so is beautiful, that's just my opinion. But the point is, on what grounds do we say there's no objective qualities? Like beauty, like goodness. The modern philosophers want it both ways. They say that, oh my God, okay, I'll stop soon. Don't panic. It's interesting because forever in Western philosophy, it was understood that we can talk about objective good and bad because there's a God and there's a soul. For example, we can say objectively that it is morally wrong to kill babies. That's not, well, that's just your opinion. No, it's objectively wrong. And the philosopher Kant said that we are endowed with an objective, powerful moral intuition, which we can access. And so if there's no God and there's no soul, what does it mean to say that something's objectively wrong? What does it mean to say that we're equal? because our bodies aren't equal. Jai Govinda can obviously run faster than anyone else in this room. Anyway, we joke a lot. So,
Speedy Gonzalez.
yes. So, if you say, let's say, for example, someone commits something which is uncontroversially evil, like killing an innocent person. Now, you can make an empirical study of that act, do all the forensic investigation. What was the, what was the weapon that was used? How was it applied? How much pressure was applied? Fingerprint. I mean, you can do all the forensic studies of that act and you will not find evil. This was actually, ironically, here we have to, tip of the hat to sort of a real mischief maker, the philosopher David Hume, who said simply that you cannot derive a metaphysical fact from a physical fact. In other words, let's say, again, something which we accept as an evil act, killing an innocent person. Now, there's all the empirical facts of that event, but you want to also claim a non-empirical fact, namely that it was evil. That's not empirical. There's no such thing as evil. It doesn't exist empirically. It's not a material object. So if you say, well, look, he killed this innocent person, fine, but that's a physical event, a physical fact. How do you derive a metaphysical fact from a physical fact? Answer, you can't. At least not if you want to be a rational human being. A metaphysical fact, namely that was an evil act, or let's say you risked your life to help an innocent person, which everyone agrees that you were a hero. That was an act of significant virtue. Well, how do we say that? All we know is you jumped in the water, you splashed around, grabbed a hold of this person, and brought them out. So Hume would say the physical act, how can you say it was virtuous? Because there is no empirical thing which is a virtue. There's no such thing. I'm not saying there's no such thing as virtue, but it's not empirical, it's not physical, it's metaphysical. And actually, there was one of the founders of the country who was not quite as, philosophically brain dead as the modern society. And so when he wrote a very important document, he was aware of Hume's objection because he was writing, in the same century as Hume. And therefore, he wrote the document in such a way as to avoid Hume's objection. The person I'm speaking of is Thomas Jefferson. The document is the Declaration of Independence, which was specifically written to avoid Hume's objection. And it's actually a philosophically sophisticated document, if you know philosophy. So I'll explain what I mean by that. First of all, he said, we hold, actually not first of all, but very soon after the beginning, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He hadn't made the gender curve yet. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that, that we're all created equal, endowed by the Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now he made two philosophical moves there, which are very important. One is expressed by the term self-evident. That means Jefferson knew his Aristotle. And he knew that if we come up with this, what's going to seem in Europe to be like this insane idea that we're created equal, which, in good society in Europe, that would be considered just madness. And so Jefferson said, I don't want to argue about it. I don't have to give evidence. It's self-evident. So he's saying it occupies the highest status, the highest epistemological status. It's self-evident. It doesn't need to be proved extrinsically. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. And then he said that we are endowed by the Creator. Why was that philosophically important? Because Jefferson knew that you cannot claim a metaphysical truth based on a physical truth. And therefore, He didn't, just like modern sort of mindless people, just say, we're all equal. Really? Why? All the empirical evidence is the contrary. What do you mean we're equal? Jefferson anticipated that objection and therefore said, endowed by the creator. In other words, he derived a metaphysical fact or equality from another metaphysical fact. There's a creator. So anyway, my hope is that we can, learn to present Krishna consciousness in a very reasonable way and explain to people. It's not just a doctrine or a dogma. It's not just a credo. It's actually philosophy. It's real philosophy, and it's really the best philosophy, all things considered. So I will stop here before I am forced out of the seat. So by hungry people, to always become hungry, they're no telling what they'll do. So, any questions on these points? Yes.
Have you considered debating Dawkins?
He's mindless. This Richard Dawkins, I mean, no offense. Well, actually, I kind of do mean to offend him, but Dawkins, first of all, he's not very bright. He may be a good scientist, but philosophically, I mean, he's very well known. Among philosophers, he's known to be kind of like a philosophical airhead. And actually, he violates the first rule of scholarship. And that is, he's making claims outside his area of expertise. He was in developmental biology or evolutionary biology. The point is, he's making philosophical and historical and statements, psychological statements, even though he's a rank amateur in all those fields. And so therefore, the fact that you have that you're a scholar in biology in no way qualifies you to make statements about religion. Just like if you have a doctorate, let's say, in religious studies, it doesn't mean you're a biologist. So therefore, no serious scholar takes him seriously. But otherwise, if he insists that I debate with him, since we're both sort of equally famous at the present time, another joke. So, yeah, but I mean, so yeah, no serious philosopher takes him seriously because he's so foolish, he's clownish, and he makes all these illogical, absurd statements that have nothing to do with the serious study of religion or psychology or philosophy. So, any other question? Yes.
It is said that some of the greatest spiritual teachers of India were produced by Kolkata and West Bengal, now West Bengal, that region. Like Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, Sharada Devi, etc., etc. In your opinion, do you have any explanation why that area produced so many brilliant minds in spirituality?
Where are you from? Just
In the
curious.
modern time.
Just curious where you're from.
My accent, Spain and Mexico.
España.
España.
Naciste en España.
Mis padres.
Oye, tus padres.
Yeah.
¿De qué parte de México?
La Ciudad de México.
Ah, como dicen, el defectuoso.
Yeah.
Sí, así dicen en México. Aprendí de los mexicanos.
Okay.
Bueno, bienvenida.
Gracias.
First of all, I mean, okay, here's some facts. I mean, I'm not sure I would consider all those people brilliant.
Mhm.
I mean, I hope I'm not sectarian or fanatical, but I know something about their teachings, but still, you could say there was a cultural flowering. I think for two reasons. Number one, Bengal in general tend to be sort of an intellectual center, and I mean centuries before these people. And secondly, the British made the capital of India in Calcutta, so it was an academic center, an intellect. I mean, so it was really Bengal really under the Raj, under the British rule, really became an intellectual center. I mean, Rabindranath Tagore, the famous poet, Nobel laureate poet. So it was, I would say, because of Bengal's own sort of attributes, and especially I think because the British were there, and so there was a tremendous amount of patronage, money, and also because the Indians were reacting to the British presence, and I mean, and so they were, and actually there was, again, without going into the specific Bengali figures, who I in some cases have certain views on, but one thing I can say is that the British presence in India challenged Hindu society in a way the Muslims didn't. Even though the Muslims were, they were brutal, and they were, I mean, if you want to talk about atrocities, we'll be here for a week just listing them, which explains something of what's going on in India today. And but the Muslims were not a religious threat or cultural threat, because when the Muslims invaded India about 1,000 years ago, they basically brought the same technology that already existed in India. And as far as Muslim scholarship, no one was like, wow, because actually, in terms of theology, India had much more sophisticated scholarship. I mean, there's no comparison. So therefore, the Muslims were always a violent threat, and they gained power, but they weren't a cultural threat. And they weren't in fact, if anything, they just sort of solidified Hinduism. When the British came, there was something very different. When the British came, for one thing, what they really brought was the modern world, and that was very seductive. They brought, electricity and railroads, and just the sort of the booming scientific revolution. And so in that regard, just like in Europe itself, science became a challenge to traditional piety. I mean, that's why the university became atheistic, because they were just kind of naively impressed by all this technology and even just methodology. I mean, scholarship, studying world languages and studying world history, because India had tended to be, or more than tended, it was sort of very self-contained culture. Indians didn't go abroad very much, except just traders, might, on the Silk Road or something. And so India really was not interested in other cultures, but England and Europe brought this sophisticated, they brought universities, science, technology, and with all these sort of assets, they kind of weaponized all these things to convince Hindus that your religion is primitive. It's just sort of crude mythology. And they gave all kinds of sort of pseudo-psychological arguments and philosophical. And so England, Great Britain's presence in India was a threat because it personified, it embodied the whole modern world and the cutting edge of the modern world, because England was the cutting edge. That's where the Industrial Revolution began. So really, it was this battle between the modern scientific, university, industrial world against, what they saw as sort of these half-naked Brahmins, just with a little claws sitting in grass huts and talking about all these strange creatures that inhabit the universe. And so this was a real threat. And so what happened is, and people reacted to this threat in different ways, because the sort of like the intelligent class in India, they were aware of all this. And they tried to counter it in different ways. One way, for example, is called the Arya Samaj. The 19th century, I forgot, Dayananda Saraswati, where he started this movement, which he said, sort of in a very heretical way, that, the Upanishads and the original Vedas are that's our real tradition. And the Puranas with all these stories of creatures, that's just, we don't accept that. We only accept the older literature. And in a sense, he kind of got his cue from the West because, say, Thoreau, Henry David Thoreau at Walden Pond. Actually, actually, when I lived at Oxford, when I was studying at Harvard, I lived at one point walking distance from Walden Pond. So he was interested in the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita was greatly valued. And the Bhagavad Gita is called Gita Upanishad. It's like one of the knowledge books. And so then you had other groups that were saying that, trying to promote sort of like a neo-Hindu revival. And then you had Vivekananda, who, by the way, didn't know Vedic literature very much. In fact, I once stayed, I was a guest of this couple who, the gentleman in the house, he was the father of the wife of one of my disciples. So we went to visit and I stayed there, sannyasi in the mooching class. And so this gentleman who's Indian, he was a Hindu, and he had a whole collection of Vivekananda, like the collected works of Vivekananda. And so I started looking at it over the books, and I was saying, he doesn't know what he's talking about. I mean, saying nice things, but as far as what the actual tradition is, he doesn't know it. And of course, the father was saying no, and so I was giving examples. So I thought, okay, let's be objective. So it turns out this was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He was a professor of medicine at the University of Michigan. It's one of the best universities in the country. And so I went down to the university and I went to talk to, what's his name? Oh my God. Anyway, he's like also Indian, but he's a sort of a world famous Sanskritist and Indologist. He's Madhav Deshpande. That's his name. And he's retired, but he's still active on the Indology conference. And so he's, he's respected all over the world as a great scholar of Hinduism and Sanskrit. And he was at one of the best universities. So I wanted to talk to him, and I said I was reading these books by Vivekananda, and it doesn't seem like he knows Vedic culture very much. And this professor just laughed and said he didn't know anything about it. I'll give you one example, and this would kind of tip me off. You see, he was playing, and the reason I mention him is because he's part of the Hindu response to the modern world, and specifically to Christian Europe. So, because, Christianity is very famous as just sort of like totally guilt tripping everybody, this is a sin, that's a sin. So he was like doing this one-upsmanship. He wanted to sort of take the upper hand morally and theologically and say, well, in contrast to this, guilt-obsessed tradition you have in your so-called advanced Europe, we have a Vedic tradition that is the opposite. And so he said, and I read this is what tipped me off. He said, yes, in our culture, our Hindu culture, Vedic culture, no one will say you are sinful. We don't talk about sin. Because he was trying to, one-upsmanship. The fact is, sin is mentioned all over the place in Sanskrit literature. Krishna talks about it. There's a whole chapter on sinful people. It's chapter 16. And so he didn't know what the heck he was talking about. And if you'll forgive me, I'm just mentioning this because, Ram Krishna, nothing against the guy, but his famous saying, like his theme song is Jatamat Tatopat, which means as many paths as there as many views or philosophies as there are that many paths. Like whatever you think, that's your path. Now, fine, maybe that's true. It's just the exact opposite of what Krishna teaches. And so, he could say like Yogananda, this is not just like bash other gurus night, but I'm not against them. It's not that I hate these people or I don't think they're the devil or something. It's just that, philosophy. So you say, yes, I accept Krishna. Yes, I accept Rama. Yes, I accept Buddha. The only problem is none of these people could ever recognize themselves in the teachings of these people. So if you look at what Krishna says about himself, and then you look at what these people say about Krishna, there's no match. And so to me, sort of like this false universality. What you do is you take all these famous religious leaders, twist them beyond recognition, and then say that you're non-sectarian, you accept everyone, but actually you don't accept any of them. Because you don't accept any of these famous people the way they presented themselves, the way they taught. And so, and that's why, I mean, you know, you're an intelligent adult, I feel like I can just, you know, tell the truth. So it's not we're against them, we don't say they're going to hell or something. But, you know, there's one big problem in Hinduism right now. And you can see this in, you know, in almost any undergraduate textbook on Hinduism. And that is one of the first things they'll say is that in Hinduism, they take orthopraxis very seriously, but not orthodoxy. Ortho means straight, like an orthodontist, straighten your teeth. You know, it's a Greek word that means straight. So orthodoxy, doxy means thought, teach, philosophy. So orthodoxy means having the right teaching. And orthopraxis means having the right practice, like you do the rituals. You do the rituals properly. And so in Hinduism, and, you know, basically some extent in Judaism nowadays, if you do the rituals and all that, no one really cares what your philosophy is. If you follow the, you know, the rules and do all the rituals. So the problem is with that, about Hinduism, is that if you study real Indian history, there's a powerful, perhaps most powerful tradition in the world of theological debate. And they took philosophy very seriously. They didn't kill each other over it. You know, they were ladies and gentlemen, but they had powerful debates and with, you know, very sophisticated logic and exegesis. And so it's just, and so how did the Indian tradition become degraded like this so that now they think, oh, who cares about philosophy? How did that happen? Well, I'll tell you what happened. It gets back to the same story we're telling. And this is, by the way, this is sort of mainstream scholarship. This is not like I have some weird website where I tell these things. Because the British really challenged Hindus in a way that Muslims didn't, by modernity, by science, by industry, by technology, by everything. A movement arose in India that we're in real cultural danger, that our brightest young people are being seduced by this. And if our brightest, you know, they're going to Oxford and Cambridge, or Scottish Churches College in Calcutta, where Prabhupada went, and they're getting seduced by this. And they're starting to look at their own tradition as primitive and mythological, and they're starting to look at, they're being seduced by the West, culturally.
It was the Vande Mataram?
The what?
Vande Mataram?
Oh, that means I worship the mother, India.
Yeah. It
Yeah.
was the counter movement, like the revolution in Calcutta.
Yeah, but
But
there was an intellectual revolution.
Mhm.
And I mean, not only India, because there was two aspects. There was just sort of Indian nationalism, like we're all India, which it never was for thousands of years. Actually, the British created India because before that, it was all these different countries. But anyway, so, which was a good thing because in ancient times there was an India too. So Vande Mataram was the nationalist movement. Like, even though we're Gujaratis and we're Marathis and we're Bengalis and we're Sikhs and Punjabis and you know, we're, you know, Tamil or we're, you know, all these different, or all that, because which were actually different countries. They not only, each state in India not only has its, well, or most of the states not only have their own language. I mean, several states have Hindi, but not only are many states their own language, they even have their own alphabets. They have their own alphabets.
Mhm.
And so India was kind of like Europe. It was a culture area with many countries. India was like Europe. And so then the British came. First, the Muslims kind of united it, and then England took over. But so in order to fight back, there was actually not a conspiracy. There was like a plan that involved Dr. Radha Krishna, the first president of India. It certainly involved Vivekananda. And the idea was that it's like we need to circle the wagons. In unity, there is strength. So in India, we have all these different traditions like, Shaiva and Vaishnava and Shakta and Tantra and this and that and everything else. Whereas there's like this monolithic force against us. They're just Christians. Before that, they were just Muslims. So what we need to do is unite and just make one religion. And let's call it Hinduism. Now, what's interesting is that the Supreme Court of India had to judge a case soon after independence in which they had to give a formal definition of Hinduism. And the reason is because Muslims were claiming that for certain things like marriage law or divorce law or this or that, or Hindus, that they had a right to follow their own tradition. And so therefore, in order to figure out what's the law going to be in India and how do we deal with this multicultural society, they had to come up with a formal definition of Hinduism for legal purposes. And the first point in the formal definition, constitutional definition of Hinduism in India from the Supreme Court is that a Hindu accepts the sanctity of the Vedas. Now, it's interesting, the Vedas don't accept the sanctity of the word Hindu. So it's not a reciprocal relationship. And of course, we know where the word Hindu comes from. It comes from the word Sindhu, which is a great river that divided basically the people we now call India and the Persians. And so on the west side of the river, they pronounce an initial S as an H. So they said Hindu. Like, for example, in the Caribbean and also in Chile, they say, para decir 10 años, they say 10 años.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. So they changed an S into an H. 10 años, 10 years, or mahalgo.
Right, exactly.
Like, yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like this international phonetic thing where some people change an S into an H. Well, anyway, so back to our main feature movie here. So therefore, they thought we need to create a one united religion to oppose the united religions of our opponents who are seducing our young people. And we'll call it Hinduism. Now, when they did that, so using the word Hindu to describe the whole religion is about 150 years old. Vedic culture is God only knows how old it is, but to call it Hinduism, in fact, there's a very good book written by a scholar who was, an article actually, Joseph O'Connell, who was a good friend of the movement. He was considered one of the leading experts on Vaishnavism. He taught at the University of Toronto. He wrote an article showing that up until that time with Vivekananda and all these other geniuses, that up until that time, Indians did not use the word Hindu self-referentially. They didn't call themselves Hindu when they were talking to each other. And what we find is, and you find this in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, this is one of the sources he used, is that people in India who followed the Vedic culture only called themselves Hindus when they were talking to Muslims. Why? Because when the Muslims invaded India, anyone who wasn't a Muslim was a Hindu, including Buddhists. So therefore, but when what we now call Hindus, when these Sanatana Dharmis or when these Vedic people, when they were talking to themselves, they never called themselves Hindus. It's only when a Muslim called them a Hindu and they didn't want to get their head cut off that they would say, okay, we're the Hindus, right? And then what happened is that Vivekananda and his Radha Krishna said, why don't we really call ourselves Hindus and have one religion so we can compete with these foreigners? And many of the most learned Hindus objected, said that's not what we are, because the serious Sanatana Dharmis, the serious Vedic people in India said, that's not Vedic. You're calling us something which is not in our Shastras. But they prevailed. I mean, they prevailed. And the reason they did it was as a strategy to prevent their, India being culturally assimilated by the Christian West. And so Vivekananda, that's the context in which Vivekananda goes to Chicago, the World Congress of Religions, and starts declaring what Hinduism is, which has very little to do with Hinduism. And I even saw this. I went to I gave a talk in a Hindu temple outside. I'm not against the Hindus. They're wonderful people, but I'm just talking about history here, not bashing Hindus. I gave a talk in a Hindu temple outside Knoxville, Tennessee. And they had a big poster on the wall, which apparently is sent to all the Hindu temples, that says, what is Hinduism? And then at the top is Ishwar that has no other name. The Lord that has no other name, has no form. It's just like, this mystery guy, or not even know if it's a guy. It's just Ishwara. And then you get Vishnu and Shiva. And in other words, it's a complete distortion of actual Indian history. It's a complete distortion of real Indian history. And it's a modern fabrication. And that's why I said, I dared to, because I actually bet on the fact that, you look like a reasonable, rational, intelligent person. So I thought, I'm just going to say it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
I hope we didn't deviate.
No. It's a pleasure. El gusto es todo mío. And the one thing, what Prabhupada is really reviving for Hindus, you could say, because now it's a historical reality. There are people that call themselves Hindus. So what Prabhupada is really reviving among Hindus, which is something which was the glory of their culture for thousands of years, in which they kind of nonchalantly threw away, and Prabhupada is now bringing back, is philosophical rigor. We're serious about philosophy. It matters. It matters. Philosophy matters. It matters to try to get it right. Like, what is God? What is the soul? In other words, we don't all need to be California hippies and, whatever you think that's your truth. What does that even mean, your truth? What if I say right now, my truth is that I'm in Manila in the Philippines. You may think you're in Dallas, but my truth is that I'm in the Philippines. What that means is I'm joking or I'm crazy. Because I don't have an independent geographic truth. I don't have an independent medical truth. This is all nonsense. And actually this nonsense is coming from some very nonsensical but very famous academic philosophers, like this, fool Rorty, postmodernism, subjectivism. I saw an interview with him where he said, there are no great truths. Well, guess what, Dick? If you're right, that's a great truth. So I guess never say never. If there are no great objective truths, that is a great objective truth. So it's a philosophical claim which, if it's true, it's false. And if you say something which, if it's true, it's false, that means you're speaking nonsense, gibberish. And yet these people actually got jobs in, famous universities. Because despite all their nonsense, they had one redeeming virtue. They were atheists. So that's why I'm emphasizing, I think one of the great contributions of Krishna consciousness is that philosophy matters. It matters to get it right. And so I will end there before people start getting up and storming the kitchen. So I guess, we'll end there. I have to pack also. Mm-hmm. Thank you all very much. You've been very patient. And I guess I'll say goodbye to everybody out there in TV land. Are they still there? Oh, there's no. Oh, there it is.